Good afternoon. My name is Kathleen Hall Jamison. I direct the Annenberg Public Policy Center of the University of Pennsylvania. It's my pleasure as the director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center to be co-hosting this conference with Searle of the Law School of the University of Pennsylvania. Our focus today is Arctic sea ice, the Arctic in general, climate change, and importantly, communication, and how do we do all of that in an extremely fraught world. Before we get to that topic and our guest panelists, some housekeeping notes. We have a Q&A session toward the end, but you're going to see a series of presentations before that. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat box throughout that time. We'll take a look at them, try to pick the best ones, and make sure they get answered at the end. You'll also see email addresses for our panelists. They've all said they'd be happy to take any other questions you have offline. Feel free to email them. We put their bios on the screen so you can take a look at who they are and read in detail all their accomplishments. I'm not going to take time to share that with you, but I am going to say that anyone posting inappropriate language or inappropriate content is just going to be taken out of the queue. And if you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE codes will be presented twice during the hour. Therefore, there'll be 2 CLE codes given via a poll that will pop up on your window. Write down these codes and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory if you want to receive CLE credit. So please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat box. These codes will tell you how long you attended. And with that as the prologue and housekeeping out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce Asheley Landrum, who's an assistant professor at Texas Tech University. And we are now going to play a video presentation that she has prepared for you, and then in sequence, presentations by Dietram Scheufele of the University of Wisconsin, Bruce Hardy, Temple University, and Matt Nisbet. And across these videos, what our scholars are going to try to do is to answer the question in this highly polarized environment, what kinds of communication cues can be presented and to which audiences are likely to be receptive? And to what extent can they overcome climate skepticism and effectively communicate the nature of the crisis and the need for action now? With that, let me ask that we cue the video for Asheley, presentation sequentially. Post your questions in the chat box. We'll be coming back on the back end.
Hello. Today I'm primarily going to talk about the effects of Pope Francis's papal encyclical on U.S. climate change attitudes. But first, I want to quickly take a step back. There are a variety of methods aiming to close the gap between what science knows and what publics believe about climate change. 3 of these methods are: 1, trying to find out the best way to explain the science; 2, highlighting the positions of those in the scientific community; and 3, leveraging the credibility and/or popularity of opinion leaders. Where each of these methods struggle to succeed, though, is that they all depend on audience members finding the source of the information credible, and they neglect to take into consideration the differing worldviews and values of the audience members. Classic work from Hublin and Weiss in 1952 demonstrated that the credibility of a source of information is a significant variable in determining attitude change. However, we should not expect that credibility is fixed. In a 2015 theoretical paper, my co-authors and I argue that when interacting with a communicator, audiences update their prior beliefs along 2 paths that jointly influence each other over time. While people use their perceptions of a communicator's credibility, such as their views about that person's knowledge and motivations, to influence how they interpret a message, they also use the information contained in that message to update their beliefs about the messenger's credibility. Let me clarify. So individuals' worldviews, values, prior knowledge, etc., are sometimes referred to as their priors. The speaker's priors influence what information is selected to present to audiences, and the audience's priors operate as perceptual filters through which communicated information is interpreted. Here, I use the globes to represent these priors. Now, let's say, for example, that a speaker says, we have a moral obligation to act to address climate change, or even 97% of scientists agree that climate change is real and human-caused. We expect that this message will be internalized by audience members, evaluated with respect to how credible they find that expert to be, and then that would update their worldviews. Now, this generally may be the case with novel information, but when people have a prior knowledge or beliefs about that issue, or when the topic of that information or its framing have political or social baggage, then we see a different path in which the people's worldviews influence the way that they perceive that message, and then that may influence the extent to which or how credible the audience finds that speaker to be. So that speaker may lose or gain credibility with those audience members. So the relevant worldview for environmental issues like climate change is political ideology. And political polarization in the US has been strengthened by a growing tendency of individual Americans to treat party identification as a type of social identity, just as they would their religious or cultural subgroups. The result of this is that we're more prone to strongly rejecting beliefs or values, or even evidence that we see as being closely tied to or coming from the other group. And this seems to be the case with climate change. One way to look at the increasing polarization on environmental issues is to look at each chamber, the Senate and House's scores on environmental voting. Although there's been a persistent gap between parties on environmental issues for decades, some scholars pinpoint the real start of political polarization on environmentalism to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, after former President Reagan's term, saying that the conservative movement replaced the Red Scare with a new Green Scare. And during one of Aaron McWright's presentations, he showed this piece of propaganda. He said, environmentalists are like watermelons. They appear green on the outside, but they are red on the inside. As with environmental issues, the political divide on climate change has increased, with stark differences between Democrats and Republicans emerging between 2003 and 2006. Public concern about global climate change does fluctuate annually, and it generally rises and falls depending on which societal issues like terrorism, war, recession, or pandemics are perceived to be most important at the time. So given all this context, to what extent can opinion leaders catalyze societal transformation? So in June of 2015, Pope Francis released the first encyclical letter addressing a global audience on issues related to the environment, global climate change, and a growing inequality between the rich and poor. Although this encyclical is about much more than climate change, US media outlets heavily emphasized the Pope's position on the issue. Several US scholars and research institutions, including the Annenberg Public Policy Center, collected data surrounding the encyclical's release and the Pope's visit to the US to see whether there would be a Francis effect. That is, would US conservatives, and politically conservative Catholics in particular, be persuaded by the Pope that we must act to address climate change? It's important to understand that the highly politicized context that the Pope's encyclical was released into. However, stakeholders were excited that this messaging was coming from an arguably socially conservative religious institution. Furthermore, Pope Francis's encyclical framed the issue of climate change as a moral one, and some expected that, in contrast to merely presenting the facts, this moral framing, combined with the Pope's authority over the Catholic constituency, would sway climate skeptics. Yet the reaction of politically conservative Catholic politicians hinted at how their constituency would also respond. Rick Santorum, for example, said, "We're better off sticking to the things that are really the core teachings of the church, as opposed to getting involved with every other kind of thing that happens to be popular at the time." And Jeb Bush said, "I don't get my economic policy from my bishops, my cardinals, or my pope." In fact, the only politically conservative Catholic politician who seemed to be influenced by the Pope's messages was John Boehner. In a recent paper, my graduate student and I reviewed the published literature and publicly available data that aimed to examine the potential influences of the encyclical on people's climate change attitudes. And today I'm going to touch on just the studies that came from the Annenberg Public Policy Center. Now, I was lucky enough to be part of this massive data collection, and we collected data in several ways. We collected a nationally representative sample prior to the encyclical's release, as well as one right after. We also recontacted 600 participants from that first sample. Then we collected a nationally representative sample before the Pope's visit to the US. And after his visit, we recontacted people from 2 of those samples. So the first paper to come out of this data collection was from Nan Lee, Joseph Hilgard, Dietram Scheufele, who will be speaking a little bit later, Ken Winnick, and Kathleen Hall-Jamieson. And this paper used data from the first cross-section, national cross-section, and then the one right after the papal encyclical. Now, the authors found that unlike those who were not aware of the encyclical, those who knew about it were much more polarized across all 3 outcome variables. That is, US progressives were more likely to believe that global climate change will have a greater effect on the poor. grant Pope Francis more credibility on the issue of climate change and express more concern about global climate change. On the other hand, US conservatives were more likely to express the opposite. Though this difference between progressives and conservatives was also identified for those who were unaware of the encyclical, the effect was much weaker. The authors believe that the result suggests strong reactance among US conservatives to the Pope's messages. However, it's also possible that political partisans with stronger views about climate change were more likely to know about the encyclical than those with weaker views. And compared to political ideology, Catholicism played less of a role. In fact, Catholic progressives responded much like non-Catholic progressives, and Catholic conservatives responded much like non-Catholic conservatives. The second paper to come out of the APBC data collection was authored by myself and my colleagues, as well as Dr. Jameson, and aimed to model the relationships among encyclical awareness, perceptions of papal credibility, and agreement with the Pope's messages on climate change. For this paper, we just used the panel data, so the 600 people who were surveyed both before and after the papal encyclical. Again, this study looked at encyclical awareness after the release of the papal encyclical, which was expected to influence both participants' perceptions about the seriousness of climate change, as well as their perceptions of the Pope's credibility. The Pope's credibility then, consistent with the prior work on credibility, was expected to influence people's perceptions of the seriousness of climate change. And of course, because climate change is such a highly polarizing issue, we expected that political ideology would influence both of these paths as well. And so here's the complicated results, but I'll go through it in a bit of a cleaner way. So we did not find a direct relationship between knowing about the encyclical and changes or increases or decreases in people's views about the seriousness of climate change. But we did find that knowing about the encyclical was related to the Pope's credibility, conditional on political ideology, such that conservatives who knew about the encyclical found the Pope to be less credible, and liberals who knew about the encyclical found the Pope to be more credible. And then people who saw the Pope as more credible saw climate change then as a more serious issue, and the reverse for people who saw him as less credible. So like I said before, climate change concern ebbs and flows depending on the issues that are most relevant to people's minds at the time. And data collected by the Gallup organization since the early 2000s shows this. US citizens' personal concern about global climate change was starting to decrease, starting from the early 2000s, from 2001 to 2004. And while this is correlational, this might be because terrorism and war were at the forefront of most of their minds. Coinciding with the release of An Inconvenient Truth in 2006 and its subsequent media coverage, concern rebounded to a peak of 41% of people in the US saying that they worry a great deal about climate change. And that was the highest recorded percentage of individuals to express concern at the time. Yet this bump was short-lived. In 2008, of course, we had the Great Recession, and concern fell back down to the 2004's four lows by 2011. We started to see concern increase again. And then, of course, when Laudato Si came out, we see another increase, now up to 45% of US adults saying that they worry a great deal about climate change. And it sort of stayed a bit consistent since. Yet now we have a global pandemic, and it would be, it's perhaps unsurprising should concern for climate change fall down as people are more concerned about healthcare and COVID-19. So again, here's data from the Pew Research Center that starts later than the data from Gallup, so starting at 2009, 2010. And you see there is a significant increase from that time in people's concern or beliefs that climate change is a major threat compared to 2009. So that is a significant increase. However, if we break this down by political ideology, we see that the increase in concern is happening mostly among Democrats. And while 31 is a larger number than 25, it is not statistically different. So most of the concern change in these beliefs have happened among political liberals. So taking away from this presentation, what I hope you remember first is that credibility isn't fixed. You can have an opinion leader take a stand on a specific issue, but in some cases they may not leverage their own credibility to increase people's concern about an important topical issue. In some cases, they may lose credibility from taking a stance on it in the first place. Second, that messaging effects vary based on who the audience is. As the Pope comes out to talk about climate change awareness, to talk about the importance of acting to address climate change. He really just influenced Democrats who were predisposed to be concerned about the issue in the first place, and political conservatives were basically unaffected. And third is that these issues fight for public attention. While climate change is an issue that is present and should be of great concern right now, some other issues are more pressing or come to the forefront of people's minds, including, elections and pandemics, and it make it very difficult for them to focus their energy on climate change. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me as part of this panel and the conference. And my apologies for not being able to be there in person, or at least virtually, but unfortunately it was impossible to move my teaching schedule around at short notice. What I'm hoping to do is to just walk you through three broad thoughts on how I think we got from climate change as a scientific issue very quickly to it as one that really focused on its policy implications, why that was so problematic given what we know from the social sciences, from decades of social science, about how we all make decisions, especially about political issues, and then leave you with at least one quick pathway forward. But why are we so focused on climate change as a politically polarizing issue in the US? And I just want to show you some data here from Gallup that ask if media coverage historically has been true to the science of climate change, or if it's been an exaggeration. And you can see how those perceptions have gone up, peaking with the Cancun conference, as I will tell you in a second, in 2010. But I think it's really important to keep in mind who one of the key stakeholders and faces of climate change is in the United States, and that's Al Gore, coming out of, at the time, a 2000 highly contested election that half of America believed was stolen from them by a Supreme Court that cut short a recount, and the other half believed was never really conceded by somebody who just ended up being a sore loser and somebody who put politics over country, fairly or not. But either way, that person won the highly polarizing loser of that election, ended up becoming the face of climate change. And I'm painting a very simplistic picture, I understand this. Along with that, we had other accounts, very popular accounts of what climate change would do to us unless we act on it. Again, Al Gore's documentary, followed pretty quickly by his share of the Nobel Peace Prize. Same year he gets an Oscar from Hollywood, seen by many conservatives as the fundraising arm of the Democratic Party, but Hollywood didn't leave it at that. They also gave him a Grammy for Best Audiobook, and then, of course, as I said, the Cancun conference of 2010. Not causal data, but simply telling you how from the beginning that problem in the minds of many Americans, and certainly many conservatives, was set up as one where Democrats are trying to use science to push through regulatory policy that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to push through. And scientists have fueled that fire, not just on climate, but on general, on separating science from other value-based groups in society. Neil deGrasse Tyson tweeting on Christmas Day, for instance, that many years ago, a child was born who by the age of 30 would transform the world. Happy birthday, Isaac Newton. Very funny if you're not Christian and if you have absolutely no religious beliefs, and I happen to not have them. But trolling Christians on Christmas is not a really good way to open a conversation about issues like stem cell research, tissue engineering, that ultimately are at odds with many of the values that the groups hold who we would like to start this conversation with. Bill Nye the Science Guy yelling at audiences on Netflix and elsewhere about growing the F up and just accepting the facts of climate change. Again, there's zero pieces of social science that suggest that that is a good way of connecting with audiences that may be hostile or at least doubtful about the message you're sending. And Michael Mann, climate scientist at Penn State, who actually won recently the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Public Engagement Award for outstanding engagement work, routinely calls Republicans as not, or describes Republicans as not being safe to have in Congress. Again, vilifying a whole party and a whole conservative outlook that you want to connect with on climate change is counterproductive, I would put out as a hypothesis. It's especially counterproductive given what we know from the social science about motivated reasoning, from different areas of social science about motivated reasoning. We know that the same facts are not processed the same way by all of us. In fact, all of us engage in what's called motivated reasoning. We weigh more heavily facts that fit our priors, our values, our beliefs, things we hold sacred. And we assimilate, this is what biased assimilation is all about, we assimilate new information into those firmly held values or priors in order to protect our identities that are important to us, faith-based or whatever else. That may not be that surprising in politics, but it certainly raises a challenge that I think we don't appreciate enough in science, and that is that the same scientific facts, by definition, will mean different things to different people. Let me just show you one example here really quick from Wisconsin, where we looked at renewable energy and public buy-in, and you see on the x-axis how much people learned about new technologies from newspapers, from television, and on the y-axis how positive they were about the potential benefits for the economy in the state of Wisconsin. Net positive above zero, net negative below zero. For Democrats, the more they learn, it fits their priors. They want to believe that this is true, that it's good for the economy. And of course, that's exactly what happens. The more they learn, the more excited they get. For Republicans, the exact opposite happens. The more they learn, the more pessimistic they get about the economic benefits. And as countless studies have shown, the gap is widest for those who have the most information. So the most information comes their way, the more polarized they get. All of us get, I should say. One potential intervention, of course, happened when Pope Francis came to the U.S. and a lot of people hoped that he would be a credible spokesperson that actually could connect the facts of climate change to priors, to belief systems that they wouldn't be at odds with, because he is a religious conservative person speaking to climate change, which he had in an encyclical letter just before coming to the U.S. Is that climate change is real, it's man-made, and we need to do something about it. So you will remember these pictures from Philly, and so again, the hope was, well, as the Pope speaks to either liberal audiences on the x-axis here on the left or conservative audiences on the right, concern of climate change hopefully will rise a little bit among conservative audiences and make them more similar to maybe liberal audiences. The opposite happened. The line, the darker line are people who are aware of the encyclical, who had read it, who had heard about it. The red ones are the ones who hadn't. In fact, polarization is stronger, not weaker, among those who had heard about it. Democrats who had heard about the encyclical were even more concerned. Republicans were even less concerned. So what happened there? Let me show you the second graph, and that's now having the Pope's credibility on the y-axis. What ended up happening is that liberals who read the encyclical, who were aware of it, thought that the Pope was an even more credible messenger now than they did before reading the encyclical. And for Republicans, for conservatives, it was flipped around. So in other words, what ended up happening is that conservatives adjusted their view on the Pope and basically in their mind said, well, he can't be a credible messenger. Why? Because he says something about climate change that doesn't fit my priors. So even the Pope cannot overcome some of the strong priors that drive motivated reasoning on an issue that we polarized and politicized from day one with Al Gore as a spokesperson. So how can we communicate across tribal fault lines? And I just want to end with a couple of thoughts here on what a lot of my work has focused on, and that's called framing. So framing is the idea that by embedding or by using certain terminology or imagery, I can basically set the frame of reference in which any given piece of information is being processed. Are we talking about the death tax or the estate tax? Are we talking about gun control or gun safety? By simply changing the terminology, I will make it more likely that audiences connected to different mental schema. Gun safety, for instance, the idea that gun accidents, children are affected, school shootings. And when I say gun control, what gets activated are Second Amendment rights, constitutionally guaranteed rights, things that most Americans don't want to do anything about or change anything about. Frankenfood was a great example of that. Simply by adding the term Franken, I can connect a complex technology to a story that says science puts stuff together, doesn't belong together, it gets out of control, gets out of the lab, impossible to rein back in. I set all of that by basically connecting and using as a frame of reference a story that we all know. But that same process, of course, is also really important for climate change. Why? Because certain adaptation or mitigation tools will seem at odds with ideological values, economic prosperity, and so on, that climate hostile audiences would have. And this is work by Bob Inglis and Republican with an EN at the end, so an organization that tries to frame climate change in a way that would make it not inconsistent with conservative values and prior, so that uses motivated reasoning as a tool to reach audiences rather than to segregate them into tribal identities that are hard to overcome. Mitt Romney, of course, used that very successfully in his presidential run, or successfully from an outcome perspective, from an electoral outcome perspective, maybe not, but from a communication perspective, is very smart. And he basically said, I'm not going to talk about climate because it's going to turn off conservative audiences. I will talk about two things. I will talk about global competitiveness, investing in renewable energies, in sustainable energy solutions, because we want to compete on a world market with a lot of other countries that are trying to get a share of that market. It just makes economic sense. Or energy independence, it makes security sense to not fight wars in countries that we can't even accurately place on a map if we can find sustainable, renewable energy solutions at home. All of these things happen to also help with climate change mitigation and maybe in some cases adaptation. But more importantly, they resonate with values that different groups hold in society, conservative and liberal. And so rather than, again, alienating some tribal identities, they really are aimed to bring them together. So framing helps us kind of hopefully alleviate some of the very problems that we started by politicizing the issue so deeply from the get-go. So I'll leave it at that. I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to chat with you, and I'm really sorry that I don't have the opportunity to have a little bit more of a direct back and forth with the other panelists and certainly everybody at the conference, but these are weird times, and hopefully we'll get to do that soon. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Today, I am going to talk about the live messaging structure that Dr. Kathleen Jamison and I developed for overcoming ideological and endpoint bias. It's been well established that those who are conservative and identify as Republican tend to reject the notion that human activity is causing climate change, and those who are liberal and identify as Democrats tend to accept it. We can see that trend here in this 2019 data from Pew. Underlying this is this notion of effective polarization in which in-group and out-group cleavages have widened in recent years. Basically, Democrats are very favorable towards other Democrats, but have a dislike towards Republicans, and Republicans are very favorable to fellow Republicans and dislike other Democrats. But what's interesting is we can see that it's dislike of the out-group that's increasing its cleavage. Now, this can influence information processing. What happens is people's political identity and ideological identity are made salient in a 24-hour news environment that has partisan media, as well as the political enclaves people find themselves in social media. And this interacts with this affinity for this in-group and dislike for the out-group that we see in effective polarization. And that influences information processing. And we can think of this as identity protective cognition. That is, when people are exposed to information that affirms their identity and their affinity group, they're readily accept it. But when they're exposed to information that threatens their identity and threatens their affinity group, they're really likely to reject it. This also is confirmation bias, so people will tend to believe information that confirms a pre-held belief and reject information that doesn't, and is related to motivated reasoning, which I'll talk about in a few slides. Another bias that we are interested in overcoming is endpoint bias, and this is that people have a tendency to judge an entire situation by the end. And when we think about events, people always say, oh, you have to end on a high note, right? This kind of same idea. So if you have this event and you end on a very positive note, people use that endpoint as a reference to judge how the whole event was. And people do this with trend data and climate change data too. They tend to take the most recent data point and use that to make judgments about climate change. People also tend to overvalue a recent change in the trend. So if there's a downward trend and it's going down and there's a little recent uptick, people tend to really value that recent uptick and kind of dismiss the overall trend. Now, we saw this in 2013 in Arctic sea ice. Now, this is a Fox News article that we ended up using as a piece of stimulus in the experiment that I will walk through in a few moments. And basically, the Fox News article says Arctic sea ice is up 60% in 2013. They show images of 2012 against 2013. And down at the bottom, it says there's about 1 million more square miles of ocean are covered in ice in 2013 and 2012, a whopping 60%. So Fox News article is really focusing on those last two data points and this recent uptick and dismisses the overall trend. Now, if we look at the overall trend, we see 2012 was the lowest extent at the time since they started collecting data in 1979. And 2013, while a 60% increase, is still the sixth lowest that's on record. So that endpoint bias, people's tendency to overvalue a change in the trend line, mixed with the ideological cues of Fox News, we thought that this article would have an effect, particularly on conservatives. So we developed the LIVA model as a way of overcoming ideological and endpoint bias. And the LIVA model stands for leverage source credibility. So when we think about the Arctic sea ice extent, data comes from NASA. So we really leverage NASA and how great NASA is. And both Republicans and liberals across the aisle, they tend to really have positive feelings towards NASA. We involve the audience by asking them very specific questions. Now, this part is important because this goes back to this motivated reasoning. So when we think about motivated reasoning, there's two types of motivations that people tend to have. There's directional motivations, and this is individual, goal-oriented. This is very identity protective. I think this is what people kind of use directional motivations to reject climate science. It's very emotion-based, and it's often based on heuristics. Now, there's also accuracy motivation, and accuracy motivation plays on people's inherent need to want to be right. And if we can kind of get people out of the directional motivation, which is kind of where the ideological biases live, and pull them into an accuracy motivation, where accuracy is a goal, people tend to have much more deeper cognitive processing. They tend to be less emotional and less reliant on heuristics. So the V stands for visualize a trend, right? So the Fox News article only focused on those last two data points and just kind of dismissed the overall trend. So you really need to have to show the whole trend and finally analogize the trend. Now, analogies are very persuasive and they're very helpful in taking complex information and providing some sort of context to it that makes it familiar to the audience to understand. So how do we test a LIVA model? We did this in a randomized experiment where we had the first condition, those respondents were exposed to the Fox News article that we just showed you. On condition 2, they were exposed to Fox News and the LIVA model, and I'll walk through how we operationalize the LIVA model in the next few slides. And then condition 3 was our control, and they just read about the history of baseball. So how did we operationalize the LIVA model? So the first thing that we did was we really wanted to leverage NASA. And so they had to read this prose that basically said, NASA's great, NASA's great, NASA's great. And so we talked all about all the positive things that NASA has done to really leverage the source credibility of the data. And then we visualized the trend line. And we actually did it in a video where you can see here, it actually again, we leveraged NASA. And then you can see that we did it in a way that every time there's a decline, we said, this is a decline, this is a decline, this is a decline. And to really make a point that this is a downward ongoing trend. And then to involve the audience, we asked a whole bunch of questions that were really specific from year to year. Now, this really pulled people out of their motivated reasoning, out of their identity protective cognition state, and into more of an accuracy motivations. And then finally, we provided an analogy. And our analogy was an NASA scientist explained that expecting sea ice extent to return to its 1979 level based on the improvement in 2013, it's like earning a C on a first exam, a D on a second, an F on a third, a D on a fourth, and as a result, that recent D anticipating an A on the final. And so what we found, and let's look at conservatives over here first. So those were the folks that we were mostly interested in. And what we found is that compared to the control, baseball control, people's knowledge about Arctic sea ice definitely decreased when you're in the Fox News article. So the black bar here is a Fox News article, but one with the LIVA model that increased above and beyond the control, right? So it kind of overcame the effect of Fox and actually did more than just those in the control. Among moderates, you can see that there wasn't much difference between the LIVA model and the control, but the Fox News article had that effect on moderates. And what we also found is that the Fox News article actually had a large effect on liberals too. So this is our knowledge questions. And then we also had our forecast scale, which asks people a bunch of questions about if we'll see future levels of sea ice, if they will increase or not. And as you can see across liberals, across moderates, and across conservatives, those black bars, those folks who were only exposed to the foxnews.com article, those respondents all reported much higher levels of forecasting sea ice. However, when exposed to the LIVA model and the Fox News, the LIVA model reduced that effect. So we wanted to see if this effect lasted, so we did a recontact study about 2.5 months later, and we didn't really find an effect because you need to have continued exposure, you need to have continued correction. Basically what happens after people left the experiment or they went into their social networks, they went into their media environments where they were re-exposed to information that is congruent with their affinity groups. We also tested the model on recently on global land and ocean surface temperature, and we found support that really getting people to look at the graphs, to start asking them specific questions about the data, showing visualizing the whole trend line really had an impact by pulling people out of this directional motivations that they were in when processing information into an accuracy motivation. And we found that was effective. So to recap, the LIVA model stands for leveraging source credibility. Involve the audience by asking questions as to get them out of this directional motivations and into more accuracy motivations. Visualize the entire trend. Don't focus on the last few data points, and analogize the trend. Provide an analogy which creates context and familiarity for people to understand the complex information that you're trying to present. Thank you, and if you have any comments, please feel free to reach out to me via email, so bruce.hardy@temple.edu. Thank you.
Greeting everyone from Hanover, New Hampshire, where I'm wrapping up a fellowship at Dartmouth College and heading back to Boston tomorrow, Thursday. So I regret I'm not able to join you live by way of Zoom to talk about this very important topic. So with a very short 10 minutes, let me fire up my slides here. And all right, so what I want to talk about is I want to map thinking about communication by your expert community around the topic of climate change and the Arctic and Arctic security onto the public opinion dynamics and policy dynamics that we may be seeing after the November election and over the next 4 years at least. And again, in this world that we live in, everything is so highly uncertain. We're living under conditions of radical uncertainty. So I hesitate to make any strong predictions. Instead, I'm just going to focus on some principles that I think apply to what we're going to see post-November. But in fact, actually, these principles apply no matter what the outcome of the election might be, as you'll see. Okay, so the first thing to start is back in actually last year, February 2019, I wrote a commentary at Scientific American titled "The Battle Over Public Opinion on Climate is Over." And you're probably asking yourself, how can this be? How is this possible that I could actually argue such a thing, given, as we all know, that only a little more than 50% of Americans in national surveys say that global warming is mostly caused by human activities. And again, one way to look at this answers to this type of question would be look at a one point in time national survey where looking at opinions across the country. Another way to look at it, I think, is innovative and useful is at the Yale climate change opinion maps. You use Google Yale climate maps, and you'll be able to drill down into a series of questions at the national level, at the state level, at the metro area level, at the counties, and most importantly, I think, at the congressional district level. So what you can see here is when you look at the congressional district level along the north coast of the United States, the east coast, the west coast, the southwest, and Florida, we're seeing that belief is trending towards about the 60%, 65% range. But when you look in look at the more heavily Republican, conservative interior states that tend to be that trend deeper red, you can see that belief in that global warming is human caused is at 50% or below. Again, that is not surprising. In fact, actually, an answer to this question in today's sort of tribal politics no longer reflects, in most cases, what people understand or know about climate change, but rather their ideological and partisan opinion or partisan identity, given that climate change has become one of the most visible remaining focus of America's culture wars. But the thing you need to ask yourself is how much do people's answers on that single question matter? And when we focus on answers to that question, are we exaggerating public resistance or political resistance to specific policy actions that in fact have important consequences for reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And in fact, as you start to look at this, then what you start to see then is that when we look at a different type of question, the percentage of American adults who support funding research in renewable energy sources at the national level, it's 86%. In every congressional district across the country, you're looking at least 65, 70 into the 90, 80% range support. There's very few questions you can ask in a public opinion survey today or over the last 10 years that will achieve the same level of consensus support than asking people about funding research into renewable energy sources, which, in fact, jumpstarting greater R&D is a very important policy priority for any administration, or should be for any national government or future presidential administration or Congress. Even if we ask, Americans if they support regulating CO2 as a pollutant, 3/4 of Americans in national surveys say that. Again, despite only the fact that little more than 50% believe that climate change is human caused, strong majority support for some of the very basic, most important policy actions we need to start to cut emissions. And again, this support is across every congressional district in the country. And then even when you ask if they support taxing fossil fuel companies while equally reducing other taxes, 2/3 of Americans support that policy idea. Again, this would be a revenue neutral, so-called revenue neutral carbon tax. And you look across congressional districts, there's majority support in every congressional district in the country, even in the states that have a strong fossil fuel-based economy. Again, so if we start to look across the last 20 or 30 years, those few cases when major legislative shifts have happened in Congress around issues that have been contested for a long time. When we look at these policy case studies, the very few that we have, history suggests that shifts in polling and the rise of mass movements are only able to create windows of opportunity for policy change to happen. And once those moments arrive, it is behind the scenes negotiation, coalition building, and the careful crafting of policy that enables legislative passage. So we have the movement on behalf of change, and the public opinion conditions are there. And Democrats have made climate change a lead policy priority. If they're successful in the election, it will put more pressure on Republicans in vulnerable seats to also start to work on climate policy. So if the US is going to achieve a carbon-free economy by 2050, The only way we're going to do it, again, that's a huge lift. I'm doubtful that's even technically a problem. In fact, actually, we should be very doubtful if it's technically doable. But if we're going to at least to make some progress towards that goal, a pivot towards policy pragmatism will be needed that at first will likely be more incremental than transformative. We have to start thinking about at least getting to first base instead of always thinking in these policy debates when we have the opportunity to pass legislation of trying to hit a home run. And I made this point not only at Scientific American last year, but also in a longer column that I write regularly at Issues in Science and Technology magazine called The Green New Dilemma, which you can also Google and read freely.
Thank you to our participants. Let me welcome Asheley Landrum back. If Asheley could open her screen and her microphone, I'm going to give her the first question. It says, as a practicing Roman Catholic, could you please tell us, that is a practicing Roman Catholics, could you please let us know, did you highlight Roman Catholics because they are 50% of all Christians worldwide and 16% of the world's total population, or some other reason?
As well, so we highlighted this in particular because we expected that Pope Francis would be particularly persuasive to Catholics compared to other religious or social institutions. And furthermore, at the time that the encyclical was released, and of course we didn't ask the Pope to do this, right? He did this on his own. Only 45% of white Catholics believe that climate change is human caused, exacerbated by human causes, compared to 77% of Hispanic Catholics. So if the Pope was able to leverage his credibility among the Catholic constituency to encourage white Catholics to act to address climate change, then it would be a huge shift in public opinion, as you pointed out, due to the high numbers.
And I could add that we thought that the Pope, as a kind of cultural hero to many, might have some celebrity appeal in the process. And because he was coming to the United States, it provided a rare opportunity to see media reinforcing an earlier message. And ordinarily, a message gets one shot at news. So in this case, and one-shot communication doesn't usually have much chance to create an effect. The media environment churns. And as both Asheley and Dietram were pointing out, the things that are featured actually matter a lot as we try to determine whether we're going to be able to change attitudes or engage in any kind of behavioral change. So if people aren't able to focus on it, it comes into the news, it comes out of the news, it's a pretty quick phenomenon. The chances it's going to do anything are really very small, even with a major world leader. On the other hand, he issues a major encyclical, and then there is a tour in the United States that's multi-day with all the attendant media coverage. We thought the opportunity to see communication operate because of extended media coverage of him and the encyclical might increase the likelihood that we'd actually be able to study effects. We have a notice up on the screen for our CLE participants. Remember, for those of you who are getting CLE credit, you need to fill out this little form and check it and send it back in. We've got a second question that is about endpoint bias, so I'm going to take that. One question is, well, we're seeing clear warming trends. We're seeing clear losses of Arctic sea ice. In fact, the data this week looked dire for the Arctic sea ice. Isn't there a certain point at which endpoint bias works for climate communication? It works to help the climate advocates. And the answer is yes, to the extent that you don't have natural variability that has changes that look as if they are changes in direction. The problem with trend lines, there are other factors at play. There's not only one thing affecting Arctic sea ice extent. There's not only one thing that's affecting land and surface warming. There are other factors. And so we're going to see variability. And the danger is that when the variability seems to be moving toward lesser of a problem, if it is variability that looks as if it seems to be a clear change in direction, the endpoint bias can kick back in and can be used. A second is that it's ideologically convenient when that happens for partisans who want to dismiss the climate science to capitalize on endpoint bias, as Fox News was doing, and feature those limited changes in a limited period of time and not create the broader context. And there's a tendency in press coverage of events to use one-shot graphics. So you just see the picture once. Now, it's better to have the whole graphic, the whole trend line, than not have it at all. But when you only see it once, you don't have the same effect as iterating a trend line. If you want people to see a trend across time and understand why there is natural variability, but still an upward trend in the case of warming, a downward trend in the case of Arctic sea ice, you want to iterate the trend line. And Professor Hardy showed you that as the trend line goes up and down and up and down and up and down. And The people who want to say, oh, look, it's getting better, have to also accept, oh, look, wait, it went down again. And as you can see the natural variability, and then you interrogate the graph. And one key question in that experiment is, can you find any earlier year that's lower than the last 6 years? And as people try and fail, they come to understand downward trend without our ever having to explain natural variability. And so, yes, if things are consistently moving in one direction, there is some endpoint advantage. And obviously, in both of those cases, the endpoint advantage is taking us as a country in the wrong direction, but the right inference about what's happening. But still, natural variability can get in the way. We have another question. I'm going to start this one with Ashley, and then I'm going to pick it up as well. It says, research most recently, Hazlitt and Midlandberger, 2020 APSR, thank you for the citation, finds that it is extremely difficult to move attitudes on climate change. So contextualizing the presentations in the larger body of research on climate communication and political psychology, what is really the realistic likelihood of generating more public support for mitigation and adaptation measures, especially among conservatives? And Ashley, I'm going to let you take that first.
Sure. So I think in some ways, much like the trend line for global warming, we can talk about the trend line for climate change attitudes changing over time. And I think that there is actually an increase in more support for this issue. It's extremely difficult, it is, to move attitudes on climate change, but we have seen evidence that it happens. If we look at political partisan positions over time, they've shifted from saying that it doesn't exist to saying that it exists, but it's only natural causes, to saying, okay, well, humans may be the cause, but we can't do much about it. And as Professor Scheufele presented, communicators and organizations that have worked to frame climate change as values consistent have had some success shifting people over to support these issues. But then also, as Professor Nisbet pointed out, there's a great support for many of the basic policies that would act to address climate change. So how important is it that we get people to confirm, yes, I believe that climate change is real and human caused, as long as we're getting them to support the policies that are important to mitigate its effects.
And one of the things that we have suspected for a long time is that when you're engaging in a kind of ideological self-defense, what is variously called, a cognitive protective mechanism, or a kind of a polarized identity response to something, that identity also has some capacities in it that you can harness. So if I am, for example, a conservative, I like things that benefit the economy. I like things that benefit industry. I, for example, might like the idea that we are going to, and now you're beginning to see the reason that Professor Nisbet's charts are showing you what they are showing you. That I might like the idea that the economy would benefit greatly. There are jobs attached to. And so instead of featuring the potential job losses that might occur by taking carbon intensive industries into a less desired position, one can think, but instead putting into this economic framework that a conservative would view as hospitable, those ways in which the things that they value are actually incentivized, there are benefits. You also can ask what are the natural constituencies inside the various communities and how they can be brought on board. Remember, you could have had the prescription drug companies fighting the prescription drug benefit, or they could have been favoring the prescription drug benefit. They could have helped polarize, or they could have gotten on board to increase the likelihood that George W. Bush got a prescription drug benefit through. Well, why did they come on board? Because they wanted to stay in the mix, because they didn't want certain kinds of, for example, buying your drugs from Canada, including as an option within this. So to the extent that the constituencies that are acting in the lobbying capacity to thwart legislative moves can at least be neutralized or brought into the tent rather than kept out of the tent, all things being equal, you're going to increase the likelihood that you will get partisan cues from them that play into identity protective cognition for people who are inside the natural worldview that values them because of their identity with institutions that are consistent with a partisan identity. And so this is not a situation that is quite as dire as people make it out to be, both for the reasons that Ashley has articulated. The change across time is in the right direction. But secondly, there are moves that can move within this protective process. And there's one more factor in all of this that really matters a lot. Much of the research up to the last 5 years has assumed that once you get into identity protective space, you're thinking like a partisan, you're always going to be in that space. But what Professor Hardy and I have looked at, as have others, including those in the political science and psychology community, is whether we can get people out of that partisan space and move them into a space in which they're just trying to grapple with the facts. Now notice, we're not talking about policy recommendations, what we're going to do about those facts. We're just grappling with the facts, and whether we can prime an accuracy motivation, our basic human need to try to get things right. And it's fairly clear, although we don't tend to think of it this way, most of the time, we're not in highly partisan political space. We may be protecting identity, but it's not necessarily a political identity. Now, probably this week, it is a political identity with a debate, et cetera. But for most of the time, if you think of your 24-hour day, a lot of that time, your identity is not, I'm a Republican, a Democrat, et cetera, et cetera. Well, how do we tap into that to move people out of that space into an accuracy motivation? And what I like about the study, and I probably like it because I helped do it, but is that we started in partisan space. Those are Fox News signals. And what we demonstrated was, oh, the endpoint bias that was cued by those NASA pictures in the Fox News, those affected liberals and moderates as well as conservatives. Well, why the liberals and moderates? That doesn't make any sense. They're more likely to believe in climate change. They have endpoint bias in its own right. They tend to overestimate the endpoint on a trend line. It's the reason we're so bad at stock market activities. So they moved in the wrong direction against the climate science. So too did the people who are conservatives, because they had a second kind of bias. They had an identity protective bias. Could we move them out of that enough to bring them back to baseline, out of their partisan space? And the answer is yes, we could. But what did we do? We got them to answer questions, to look at data. And in the process, they made the judgment. The most powerful communication, we've known this since Aristotle, is communication. The audience fills in the assumptions. The audience draws its own conclusions. We empower the audience. And we're going to put up in the chat box something Professor Nisbet left for you, because he wants to make an important point. He wanted to make sure that we did. And we're leaving also a second part of a video from him up on the Searle website, if you'd like to see some of his other recommendations. But he thinks it's very important that we engage in dialogic communication about this, in which we start from the premise that we're all there to be open and we're all there to learn. And we don't start out by saying, we're in the morally superior position and we have the experts on our side, and by the way, you don't. And he's putting up in the chat box for you, and I think it's going to appear momentarily if it hasn't already, because I just heard it ping. And that provides a discussion of a summary of the literature and a guide to how to do that. And that's particularly relevant in a climate environment when across the nation, we are now seeing the effects of extreme weather. We know from the research that on warmer days, people are more likely to think there is global warming. Extreme weather, people are at least open to asking the questions. And Ashley mentioned COVID now, but you've got the fires burning the West Coast. That means the news media is potentially hospitable. So I'm going to try to provide a wrap up with some help from Ashley, with the promise that if you'd like to reach out and email any of us, we will put our email addresses up for you.
We have time for one more question, Kathleen?
Go ahead, go quickly.
Yeah, so we have one more question. How do we dispel the common conservative argument that we can't be sure humans are causing climate change because we do not have a consensus, even though 97% is well over consensus, while engaging climate change deniers? And I just want to quickly comment on this. I think that political conservatives that use this argument are getting it from their media, but most people don't even necessarily know what scientific consensus means. And there's been arguments over whether 97% is even a way to reference the consensus. Those studies that have looked at scientific consensus have focused on talking about consensus as a descriptive norm among scientists. So what percent of scientists actually hold this issue to be true? But that's not what the philosophy of science would say consensus is. In that sense, it's what the weight of evidence shows. And that can't be wrapped up cleanly in a pie chart and communicated to the public. So in terms of working to dispel that argument, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the most effective way to even move forward. And that probably comes both from repeating talking points that people are seeing on the media, but also just a distrust in the scientists who are presenting this information, given that their focus is on these environmental issues.
Ashley, thank you. Thank you to our other presenters. Thank you to our co-partners, Searle. Thank you to all the folks behind the scenes who've made this possible. And thank you to you for joining us for this Searle Annenberg Public Policy presentation.